In the autumn of 1983, Silas Blackwood, at 78 years old, was officially declared insolvent by the county bank. A verdict delivered 1 week after his 22 wide-horned oxen plowed up an iron wagon wheel from the hardpan of the North 40. The notice arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday, a single sheet of paper from the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Garrett County, stating a debt of $112 for 5038 and an immediate lien against the 320 acres his family had worked since 1889. The news did not come as a surprise, but the timing felt like a particular kind of cosmic joke, a dry and bitter punchline to a story nobody had asked to hear. The story, of course, was not about the debt or the bank or even the iron wheel. It was about the oxen. It was always about the oxen. Let me tell you about the farm, because you can't understand the man without understanding the land. The Blackwood place wasn't rich land. It sat in a shallow valley in western Maryland, where the soil was a stubborn mix of clay and shale that wore out plowshares and broke the spirit of men who expected easy cooperation from the earth. It was marginal land, the kind that demanded a conversation rather than a command. Silas's great-grandfather, Hezekiah Blackwood, had bought the original 160 acres for $450 an acre from a speculator who was glad to be rid of it. Hezekiah had cleared it with 2 mules and his own back, and he'd passed down a single piece of advice to his son, who passed it to his son, who passed it to Silas. The land remembers what the farmer forgets. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact, a law of their particular universe. The farm grew to 320 acres in 1946 when Silas's father bought the adjoining parcel, the one containing the North 40, for back taxes. The North 40 was 40 acres of the worst land on the whole property, a high, windswept plateau where the topsoil was less than 6 inches deep over a shelf of sedimentary hardpan so dense you could strike sparks off it with a steel tine. For 37 years, it had been used for nothing but rough pasture. No one had tried to plow it since 1947. The attempt had broken 2 discs on a brand-new Allis-Chalmers Model G. Silas Blackwood was 78 years old, had farmed this specific land for 64 of those years, and was known for 2 things: his silence and his oxen. He was a small man, wiry and bent into the shape of his labor, with hands that were more callous than skin. His physical description was unremarkable except for his eyes, which were a pale, washed-out blue and seemed to be constantly measuring distance and weather. He rarely spoke more than a dozen words at a time, and never about himself. His backstory was not in his words but in the objects he kept. The hickory handle of his grandfather's splitting maul, worn smooth and dark with the sweat of 3 generations. A collection of seed bags made of stitched linen, each with a small, hand-painted symbol indicating the contents. A system his grandmother had invented in 1902. A heavy oak table in the kitchen, built by his father from a tree that had stood where the barn was now. These things were his memory, his connection to the long, slow story of his family's survival. And then there were the oxen. They were Milledgeville horned, a breed that, by 1983, was more of a historical curiosity than a viable piece of farm equipment. They were enormous animals, averaging 2,400 pounds apiece, with a placid temperament and a hide the color of dried tobacco. Their defining feature was the massive, curving horns that could measure 7 feet from tip to tip. This was their magnificence and their curse. They were too wide to fit comfortably through modern gates or into modern stock trailers. They required a turning radius that was wildly impractical for the small, squared-off fields of contemporary agriculture. They were, by every modern metric, inefficient. They converted feed to muscle at a slower rate than a Hereford, and they worked at a pace that could only be described as geological. Silas had 22 of them. Not 20, not 25. Exactly 22. 11 matched pairs. He had inherited the last 6 from his father in 1959 and had spent the next 2 decades slowly, patiently, building the herd, trading for animals from the few other old men in the Appalachians who still kept them. He knew their bloodlines better than he knew his own. He could tell you that the lead pair, Cain and Abel, were descended from a bull brought over from the Welsh borders in the 1820s. He treated them not as livestock but as partners. He called them by name, and they responded to his low, quiet commands without the need for a goad or a whip. For decades, The community had regarded Silas and his oxen with a kind of fond amusement. They were a living piece of history, a relic from a simpler time. But by the early 1980s, with interest rates at 18% and corn prices falling to $250 a bushel, the amusement had curdled into pity and then into impatience. His neighbors were leveraging everything they had to buy bigger tractors, more effective chemicals, and patented seeds that promised an extra 10 bushels an acre. Silas was spending his time and money maintaining what looked, to everyone else, like a museum exhibit. Let me tell you about the confident outsider, because every story of quiet competence needs a voice for loud, conventional wisdom. His name was Mark Renslow. He was 42 years old, had a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Maryland, and had worked for the county extension office for 11 years. He was not a bad man. He was, in fact, a very well-meaning man. He genuinely wanted to help the farmers of Garrett County survive. He drove a county-owned Ford sedan, wore crisp polo shirts, and carried a leather briefcase full of soil reports, commodity futures charts, and loan amortization schedules. He believed, with an almost religious fervor, in data. To him, farming was a business like any other, a system of inputs and outputs that could be optimized for maximum efficiency and profit. He saw the Blackwood farm not as a legacy but as an underperforming asset. In May of 1983, 5 months before the insolvency notice, Renslow had paid Silas a visit. He brought Silas's grandson, Caleb, with him. Caleb was 24, a good kid who loved his grandfather, but who also saw the foreclosure notices piling up on the kitchen table. He was the young inheritor, caught between two worlds, wanting to honor the past but terrified of being buried by it. They all sat at the old oak table. Renslow spread his papers out, a sea of white overwhelming the dark, scarred wood. "The numbers are stark, Silas," he'd said. His voice was reasonable, calm, the voice of a doctor delivering a difficult but manageable diagnosis. "Your input costs are 30% higher than the county average, and your yield per acre on the corn is 22% lower. You're spending a fortune on pasture and feed for animals that are, forgive me for being blunt, obsolete." Caleb shifted in his chair, not looking at his grandfather. Renslow pointed to a glossy brochure for a John Deere 8650 tractor. 4-wheel drive, 290 horsepower, air-conditioned cab. A beautiful machine. "The bank is willing to finance a new equipment loan," he said. "We sell the oxen. The Historical Society in Grantsville might pay a premium for them, maybe $1,200 a head. That's $26,400. It's a significant down payment on this machine. We lease it for the first year. We put the whole 320 acres, except the North 40, into Pioneer Hybrid 3377 corn. We use a December 12 nitrogen phosphorus potassium fertilizer blend at 400 pounds per acre, and we spray with atrazine for weed control. The projections show a 35% increase in yield within 1 year. Enough to service the new debt and start paying down the principal on the mortgage." He tapped a spreadsheet. The numbers don't lie. Silas had sat there for a long time, looking not at Renslow's papers but at the grain of the wood on the table. He ran a thumb over a deep gouge left by his father's pocketknife 60 years before. He had heard this kind of talk before. It was the song of the modern world, a tune of speed and scale and the belief that the future could be calculated in advance. He finally looked up, his pale eyes meeting Renslow's. "Your numbers only count what you can measure," he said. "What else is there?" Renslow asked, with a small, uncomprehending laugh. Silas didn't answer. He just stood up and walked out to the porch, leaving the two younger men with their spreadsheets and their certainty. Caleb had followed him out. "Grandpa," he'd pleaded, his voice tight with worry, "we're going to lose this place. Everything you and Dad and Grandpap built. We have to do something." Silas looked out over his fields, toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the North 40. He put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "The land remembers what the farmer forgets," he said. Then he walked down the steps toward the barn, where the oxen were stirring in the evening cool. The conversation was over. For the next few months, things got worse. The price of feed went up. A summer drought stunted the corn. The bank sent 2 letters, then a third, each more threatening than the last. Caleb argued. He pleaded. He despaired. He saw Renslow in town, and the extension agent would just shake his head with a look of professional sympathy. He tried, "Son. The old man is just too stubborn." And then, in late September, Silas did something no one expected. He announced he was going to plow the North 40. He didn't announce it in a loud way. He just told Caleb one morning over breakfast, "We're taking the big plow up to the north field tomorrow." Caleb stared at him. "Grandpa, you can't. That ground is like rock. It'll kill the animals and it won't do any good. There's no soil up there. Renslow's analysis showed it's 80% shale aggregate. It's useless." Silas just drank his coffee. "We'll see," he said. Word got around the way it does in small communities, passed over telephone lines and feed store counters. Silas Blackwood's finally lost his mind. He's going to try and plow the North 40. With those museum-piece oxen. It became a spectacle. A final, desperate, foolish act. When the day came, a cool, clear morning on the 1st of October, there were nearly 50 people parked in cars and trucks along the dirt road that ran past the field. Neighbors, other farmers, a few curious townspeople. Mark Renslow was there, leaning against his Ford, his arms crossed, a look of grim vindication on his face. He was there to witness the failure he had predicted. He didn't see it as cruel. He saw it as a necessary lesson. Sometimes, the old ways had to be proven wrong in public before people would embrace the new. Let me tell you about the plow because it was as much a character in this story as the men and the animals. It wasn't a modern implement. It was a great Western breaking plow, built in the 1890s in Moline, Illinois. Silas's grandfather had bought it used in 1912. It was a monstrous thing, made of cast iron and steel, with a single massive 24-inch share designed not for turning soft soil but for breaking virgin prairie. It weighed 1,200 pounds and required at least 8 yoke of oxen to pull through tough ground. It had sat rusting behind the barn for 50 years. Silas had spent the previous week restoring it, grinding the rust off the share, oiling the coulter wheel, and reinforcing the beam with a plate of steel. It was a tool from another era, designed for a different kind of problem. Silas and Caleb spent 2 hours yoking the 22 oxen. It was a slow, quiet ritual. The heavy wooden yokes were settled onto the animals' necks. The iron rings and chains were fastened. The animals were calm, patient, used to the routine. They stood in a long, powerful line, 11 pairs, their horns a forest of polished bone, their breath misting in the cool morning air. They were hitched to the great plow with a series of chains that distributed the load across all of them. The total weight of the team was over 26 tons. The total pulling force they could exert, what engineers call tractive effort, was immense, but more importantly, it was slow and continuous. A tractor delivers power through the violent, percussive force of an internal combustion engine, transferred to spinning wheels that can lose traction. This team was different. It was 44 hooves digging into the earth, a gradual, inexorable application of mass and muscle. Silas took his position at the handles of the plow. Caleb stood at the head of the team, ready to guide the lead pair. Silas looked out at the field, then at the line of silent watchers. He didn't acknowledge them. He took a deep breath, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the field. "Hup, Cain." The long line of animals leaned into their yokes. The chains drew taut with a sound like a deep, resonant chord. The 1,200-pound plow shuddered. For a moment, nothing happened. The team strained, their muscles bunching. Renslow, by his car, shook his head slightly. A waste of time. Then, with a groan of stressed metal and a great tearing sound from the earth, the share bit in. It dug down through the thin layer of grass and topsoil 6 inches, then 8, then 10. It hit the hardpan with a shriek of steel on stone. The plow bucked, and Silas, with the practiced strength of a lifetime, wrestled it level. The oxen didn't stop. They lowered their heads and pulled. They moved at a walking pace, maybe 1 mile an hour. But they did not stop. Behind them, they left a single, deep furrow. It was not the neat, tidy line of a modern moldboard plow. It was a trench of shattered rock and earth. They were not plowing the North 40. They were disassembling it. They were breaking it apart. Slabs of shale and clay the size of dinner plates were heaved up and turned over, exposing soil that hadn't seen sunlight in 10,000 years. It was a violent, elemental process, and the crowd watched in stunned silence. The sound was not of farming, but of quarrying. The rhythmic creak of the yokes, the jingle of the chains, and the continuous, grinding roar of the plowshare fighting the earth. They worked all morning, back and forth across the 40-acre field. The sun rose higher. Renslow remained by his car, his arms still crossed, but the confident set of his jaw had slackened. His spreadsheets had not accounted for this. His data had no column for this kind of patient, overwhelming force. His soil analysis had tested the top 6 inches. It had pronounced the field useless based on a shallow understanding. Silas was operating on a different axis of knowledge, a knowledge that went deeper. Caleb, walking with the lead oxen, felt a change happening in him. With every slow, steady step of the team, his anxiety was being replaced by a profound sense of awe. He was watching his grandfather not as a stubborn old man, but as a master of a craft so old it felt like a form of magic. He was seeing the oxen not as obsolete liabilities, but as a living engine perfectly suited to this one impossible task. They were the key that fit this specific lock. The land remembers, his grandfather had said. Now, Caleb was watching the land be forced to give up its secrets. It was just after noon on the 7th pass across the field when it happened. They were in the lowest part of the plateau, a shallow basin where water tended to pool. The team was pulling steadily, the plow grinding its way through the hardpan at a depth of nearly 18 inches. The lead plowshare struck iron. The sound was not loud, but it was utterly distinct from the noise of steel on rock. It was a dead, solid thud, followed by a high-pitched metallic screech as the 1,200-pound plow was thrown sideways, wrenching the handles from Silas's grip. The entire team of oxen came to an instant halt, as if they had hit a wall. The sudden silence was deafening. Every person along the road took a step forward. Silas recovered himself and walked to the front of the plow. He knelt down in the furrow. Caleb ran back from the head of the team. Together, they began to dig with their hands in the churned-up earth. Renslow got out of his car and started walking toward them, his curiosity finally overcoming his professional detachment. The other farmers began to get out of their trucks, drawn in by the sudden, unexplained stop. What they uncovered was a large, curved piece of rusted metal. It was the rim and spokes of a wagon wheel, nearly 4 feet in diameter, made of solid iron. It was impossibly heavy. As they cleared more earth, they saw it was attached to an axle, and the axle was attached to the splintered remains of a heavy oak wagon frame. They had not just found a wheel. They had found the wreckage of a Conestoga-style freight wagon. Renslow was the first to speak. What in the world? No one answered. The farmers gathered around, looking down into the furrow at the impossible object. It was old, very old. One of the old men, a neighbor named Elias Miller whose family had been there almost as long as the Blackwoods, bent down and touched the pitted iron. He whispered, "That's a military freight wagon. From the Braddock expedition." He was referring to the ill-fated British campaign against the French in 1755, a foundational piece of local history. General Braddock's army had cut a road through this part of Maryland on their way to Fort Duquesne. The story was well known, but the exact route had been a matter of historical debate for 2 centuries. "Can't be," another farmer said. "Braddock's road was 5 miles south of here." Elias Miller shook his head. The main road was, but they had survey parties and supply wagons out all over, looking for flatter ground. This basin, it would have been a swamp back then. Wagon must have gotten mired, broken axle, and they abandoned it. The whole thing just sank into the muck. Over the next 2 centuries, it was covered with silt and rock washed down from the rest of the plateau. It was buried so deep, under a layer of hardpan so thick, that no normal plow would ever have touched it. It took 26 tons of slow-moving animal power, pulling a 1,200-pound prairie plow, to find it. The discovery of the wagon was remarkable, a one-in-a-million shot. A local historian was called, and it was confirmed. It was a supply wagon from Braddock's army, lost in June of 1755. It was a significant historical find. The university sent a team. There were articles in the paper. For a few weeks, the Blackwood farm was famous. But the iron wheel was not the point. The bank didn't care about historical artifacts. The insolvency notice arrived a week later, exactly as predicted. The discovery had changed nothing, and it had changed everything. Let me tell you about what the plow really turned up. It wasn't the wheel. The wheel was just the catalyst, the thing that made everyone look closer. The real discovery was the soil. By breaking up the hardpan to a depth of nearly 2 feet, Silas and his oxen had done something that modern equipment could not. They had aerated the deep, mineral-rich subsoil and mixed it with the thin layer of topsoil. They had shattered the impermeable layer of rock that had prevented water from draining properly, the very thing that had created a swamp 200 years ago and a useless pasture for the last 50. The North 40 was not bad land. It was just land that had a very specific problem, a problem that required a very specific old-fashioned solution. Renslow came back to the farm 2 weeks after the discovery. He didn't bring his briefcase. He walked with Silas to the edge of the newly plowed field. The churned-up earth was already changing color as it was exposed to the air. Renslow picked up a clod of the deep soil, a mix of dark earth and shattered yellow shale. He crumbled it in his hand. "My soil test was wrong," he said. "Or not wrong, but incomplete. It only told me what was on the surface. It didn't tell me what was possible." "It told you what your tools could see," Silas replied. Renslow nodded, looking at the 22 oxen grazing peacefully in the next pasture. He finally understood. Silas hadn't kept the oxen out of nostalgia or stubbornness. He had kept them because they were a tool, and he knew with a deep generational knowledge that there were some jobs that required that specific tool. He had been waiting for the right problem to solve. The farm's impending failure had simply forced his hand. He looked at Silas. "What will you plant here?" Silas pointed to one of the old linen seed bags leaning against the barn. It had a stylized picture of a root painted on it. "Chicory," he said. Renslow was confused. "Chicory? There's no market for that. It's a weed." Silas shook his head. "Not this kind. This is puntarelle, an Italian variety. My grandmother got the seeds from an immigrant family who worked on the railroad in 1910. It needs deep, well-drained, mineral-rich soil. Puts down a taproot 3 feet long. It won't grow anywhere else around here. But it will grow here. Now." The bank, however, was not interested in long-term agricultural experiments with obscure Italian vegetables. The foreclosure process moved forward. The farm was scheduled for auction on November 15th. The story seemed to be ending exactly as Renslow had first predicted, with the failure of the old ways and the triumph of the balance sheet. The discovery of the wheel and the revitalization of the North 40 were just footnotes in a sad, familiar story of rural decline. But the story had been witnessed. The 50 people who had watched the plowing had seen more than a stubborn old man's folly. They had seen something that worked when it shouldn't have. They had seen a kind of power they had forgotten existed. Elias Miller, the old farmer who had identified the wagon, started making phone calls. He talked to the other farmers who had been there. He told them Silas was right. That land isn't useless. He knew something we didn't. He didn't just save a field, he made a new one. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the decisive moment is never the end of the story. On the day of the auction, the whole community showed up. The auctioneer stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch where Silas had stood when he walked away from Renslow's proposal. The farmers of Garrett County stood in the front yard. They weren't there to bid on the land. They were there to bear witness. When the bidding started, a strange thing happened. There was only one bidder, a cooperative newly formed called the Garrett County Heritage Land Trust. Its members were the farmers who had watched the plowing of the North 40. They had pooled their money. Not a lot, but enough. They put in a single, low bid for the farm, just enough to cover the bank's outstanding debt of $112,45038. The bankers, who had shown up from the city, hoping to sell the land to a developer for 3 times that amount, were furious. But there were no other bidders. Not a single one. The farmers just stood there, their arms crossed, staring at the bankers. It was a silent, immovable wall of community resolve. The auctioneer, seeing there would be no more bids, had no choice. The gavel fell. Sold. The co-op didn't take the farm from Silas. They leased it back to him and to Caleb for $1 a year, on the condition that they continue to farm it, and that a portion of the North 40 be set aside for teaching young farmers about older techniques. It wasn't a handout. It was an investment. They were investing in a kind of knowledge they had almost allowed to disappear. Caleb took over the running of the farm the next spring. He did not sell the oxen. He learned their names, their temperaments, the quiet language his grandfather used to command them. He planted the punterelle chicory on the North 40. The deep, shattered soil was perfect for it. The crop was magnificent. He found a market for it with specialty grocers and high-end restaurants in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It was a niche product, but it was highly profitable. It didn't make the farm rich, but it made it solvent. Caleb didn't reject the new ways entirely. He bought a smaller, more efficient tractor for the other fields. He used soil testing, but he also learned to read the land the way his grandfather did, by watching the way the water moved, the kinds of weeds that grew, the color of the earth. He used Mark Renslow spreadsheets, but he added new columns for things that were harder to measure: soil health, biodiversity, long-term resilience. He integrated the 2 kinds of knowledge, the old and the new, creating something stronger than either one alone. Mark Renslow was transferred to a different county a year later. The story of Silas Blackwood's oxen had become a bit of an embarrassment for the Extension Office, a public refutation of their data-driven evangelism. But to his credit, Renslow learned from it. Years later, he would tell young agents, "Your numbers are a map. They are not the territory. Never forget that." Silas Blackwood lived for another 7 years. He spent most of his days sitting on the porch watching Caleb and the oxen work. He never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. His vindication was in the deep green of the chicory growing on the field everyone had said was worthless, in the continued presence of the wide-horned animals everyone had said were obsolete, and in the quiet confidence of the grandson who was now carrying the long story forward. He was buried in the family plot on a hill overlooking the North 40. What survives is not always the strongest or the fastest. What survives is what fits, what adapts. The world is full of locks that require old, forgotten keys. The oxen were a key. The breaking plow was a key. The deep, patient knowledge of a quiet old man was a key. They were not efficient. They were not scalable. They were not modern. But on one particular field, with one particular problem, they were the only thing that could turn the lock and reveal what was buried underneath. The land remembers what the farmer forgets. And sometimes, it takes a quiet act of faith and 11 yoke of oxen to help it remember.